It all started with a whisper, a story told by a child at the market one late afternoon. The tale was of a circus like no other, a place where the performers were not humans, but animals, specifically white mice. The child, her wide eyes gleaming with excitement, spoke of the circus's incredible feats. She described the tiny acrobats who swung from ropes, the ballerinas who danced on their tiny toes, and the daring tightrope walkers who balanced on threads thinner than a hair. The story seemed so outlandish, so impossible that at first people just smiled and patted her head, dismissing it as a child's imagination running wild. But the tale stuck with him. Harlan, a man of reason, thought little of it at first. He was practical and logical, with no time for whimsy. His days were spent managing his family's bakery, his hands worn from kneading dough and carrying baskets of bread to customers. But every time the wind blew through the trees or the bells at the market rang, his mind would return to the idea of the White Mouse Circus. The name was so peculiar, so strange, that it planted a seed of curiosity that grew slowly, quietly, until it was too much to ignore. One evening, long after the bakery had closed, Harlan found himself walking down a quiet street, away from the busy part of town. The streetlights flickered overhead, casting long shadows across the cobblestones. He passed by the old theater, which had been closed for years, its once bright marquee now rusted and forgotten. But as he walked past, something caught his eye, a small poster pinned to the wall. It was faded and torn, but there was no mistaking the words written in bold red letters. The White Mouse Circus, one night only. His heart skipped a beat. The circus was real. He stared at the poster, his pulse quickening. He had to go. He didn't know why, but he knew he couldn't ignore it. Something told him that tonight, the circus would answer the question that had been gnawing at him for weeks. The performance was held in an old, forgotten part of the town, far from the main square. Harlan arrived at the tent just as the last traces of daylight were disappearing. The entrance was hidden in shadows, the heavy canvas of the tent barely illuminated by the flickering lanterns outside. There were no lines, no crowds of excited families like he had imagined. Just a small gathering of curious onlookers, their faces filled with wonder and skepticism. Harlan paid for his ticket and stepped inside. The air inside the tent was warm, thick with the smell of popcorn and something faintly sweet. The audience was sparse, seated on wooden benches that creaked under the weight of the few who had dared to come. The atmosphere was electric, charged with an energy that Harlan couldn't quite explain. The lights dimmed, and a hush fell over the crowd. A figure stepped onto the stage, a woman draped in glittering silver fabric. Her smile was mysterious, almost too perfect, and her eyes gleamed in the low light. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome," she announced in a voice that rang clear through the tent. "Tonight, you will witness wonders beyond your wildest dreams. Tonight, you will see what no human eye has ever seen before. The White Mouse Circus." Harlan's breath caught in his throat as he watched her gesture to the far side of the stage. And there they were, tiny, graceful white mice, dressed in miniature costumes, scurrying across the stage with startling precision. They moved like a well-rehearsed troupe, performing tricks and stunts that Harlan could hardly believe. One mouse did flips through hoops, while another walked a tiny tightrope, its paws moving with delicate grace. The audience gasped, their faces lit with astonishment, and Harlan couldn't tear his eyes away from the stage. The performance went on for what felt like hours. There were acrobat mice soaring through the air on miniature trapeze, a mouse orchestra playing tiny instruments, and even a mouse clown who tumbled and juggled with delightful antics. Harlan watched in awe as each act grew more fantastical, more magical than the last. The mice were more than performers. They were artists, creating beauty in every move. But it wasn't just the tricks that captivated him. It was the atmosphere. The sense of magic in the air, something that made Harlan feel as if he were witnessing a secret, something forbidden. As the show neared its end, the ringmaster stepped forward again, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "And now," she said, "the greatest act of all." The lights dimmed further, and the crowd held its breath. A hush fell over the tent, as though everyone knew that something extraordinary was about to happen. The ringmaster gestured toward the center of the stage, and a soft, eerie music began to play. Then, from the shadows, a larger figure emerged, a mouse unlike the others. It was twice the size of the rest, its fur shimmering with an almost supernatural glow. It walked with a regal air, its eyes gleaming with intelligence. The audience gasped in awe as the great mouse performed a series of movements so elegant that it seemed to defy nature. It danced with the grace of a ballerina, its tiny paws moving with such fluidity that Harlan could hardly believe what he was seeing. It twirled, leapt, and pirouetted in a display that took his breath away. The performance ended with the great mouse bowing to the audience, and the crowd erupted into applause, their cheers filling the tent. Harlan sat stunned, his mind reeling from the experience. He had come looking for an answer, and in the magic of the White Mouse Circus, he had found something beyond his wildest expectations. After the show, Harlan lingered near the back of the tent, unable to leave. He watched as the mice were carefully taken backstage, their tiny paws tapping softly against the floor. He was drawn to them, unable to shake the feeling that there was something more to this circus, something deeper than just the spectacle of it all. As he stood there, lost in thought, a soft voice called to him. "You're still here?" Harlan turned and saw the ringmaster standing behind him, her eyes bright with an understanding he couldn't quite place. I don't know why I stayed," Harlan admitted, his voice low. "There's something about this place, something magical." The ringmaster smiled, a knowing smile. "The circus does that to people," she said, "but you should leave soon. This isn't a place for outsiders to stay too long." "Why?" Harlan asked, his curiosity getting the better of him. The ringmaster's smile faded slightly, and she stepped closer, lowering her voice. "Because the White Mouse Circus isn't just a show, it's a way of life, a secret passed down through generations, and if you stay too long, you might find that it's not so easy to leave." Harlan stared at her, his mind swirling with questions, but before he could ask more, she turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows of the backstage area. Harlan left the tent that night with more questions than answers, the magic of the circus still fresh in his mind. As he made his way back home, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had stumbled onto something far more mysterious than he had ever imagined. The White Mouse Circus was more than just a performance. It was a world unto itself, a secret hidden in plain sight. It began on a moonlit night when the village was blanketed by a thick layer of snow. The air was crisp, and the trees in the forest beyond the village whispered secrets to each other in the wind. The old women in the village had gathered around the fire, speaking in hushed tones about strange happenings in the woods. For weeks, there had been rumors of wild children, not quite human, who had been seen running through the forest at night. No one had gotten a clear look at them, but the stories persisted. The children were said to be living like animals, moving in and out of the shadows, and people claimed they could hear their eerie howls at night. At first, the stories were dismissed as mere superstition, just another tale to tell around the fire. But as the sightings became more frequent, the villagers grew uneasy. Children, young and old, started to speak of shadows in the woods, figures that moved unnaturally fast, and eyes that glowed in the dark. It wasn't long before even the bravest among them began to stay close to home after sunset, afraid of what might be lurking in the cold night. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the village was shaken by a blood-curdling scream. It came from the outskirts, where the woods met the farmland. The scream was followed by a series of rapid footsteps, and then everything fell silent. The villagers gathered, fear evident on their faces, but no one ventured into the darkened woods that night. They huddled together in their homes, locked the doors, and prayed that whatever it was would go away. Days passed, and the terror of the unknown grew. It wasn't until a group of young hunters, determined to prove their bravery, decided to venture into the woods that the truth began to emerge. They went out with their bows and arrows, tracking through the snow, following the strange prints they had found. The footprints were unlike anything they had seen before, wide, heavy, and dragging, as if the children had been walking on all fours. As they ventured deeper into the forest, the air grew colder, and the trees seemed to close in around them. They moved cautiously, eyes darting between the shadows. It wasn't long before they heard something, a rustling in the brush, followed by a soft growl. They froze, their hearts pounding, their hands tightening on their weapons. Slowly, cautiously, they crept forward. What they saw made their blood run cold. There, in the clearing, stood two figures, small, ragged, covered in dirt and leaves. Their hair was wild, their faces streaked with mud, and their eyes glowed with a strange, animalistic intensity. The hunters stood frozen, unable to speak. One of the figures stepped forward, sniffing the air like an animal, its bare feet making no sound on the cold ground. The other figure followed suit, moving with an unnatural grace, almost as if it were part of the forest itself. The hunters barely breathed as they watched the creatures. They weren't just children, they were something else, something wild. One of the figures, the taller of the two, turned toward the hunters, its eyes narrowing, and without warning, it let out a terrifying howl. The sound echoed through the trees, sending a chill down the hunters' spines. The creatures turned and dashed into the woods, moving with such speed that the hunters couldn't follow. They stood there for a moment, stunned, before one of them muttered, "We need to tell the village." They returned to the village, shaken, and recounted what they had seen. At first, no one believed them. They had always been strong, proud hunters, and their story seemed too strange to be true. But when the hunters spoke of the creature's eyes, those glowing, feral eyes, people began to listen. Soon, others came forward, telling their own stories of seeing the wolf children in the woods, of hearing their eerie howls echoing through the night. The village council convened, and after much deliberation, they decided that something had to be done. They would send a group into the forest, not just to hunt the wolf children, but to understand what had happened to them. They couldn't allow the threat to grow. If these children were truly lost, they had to be brought back, to be cared for. But if they were something else, something dangerous, the village would have to protect itself. A group of 6 men and women, led by the village elder, prepared for the journey. They set out with torches and provisions, determined to find the children and bring them back to the village. They followed the tracks left behind by the creatures, moving cautiously through the trees, their eyes scanning the dark corners of the forest. Hours passed, and the group began to feel the weight of the forest closing in around them. The trees seemed to loom taller, the shadows darker. They could feel eyes watching them, and every snap of a twig made them jump. The forest was alive, and it was clear that the wolf children knew they were being hunted. Finally, as the group reached the heart of the forest, they heard it, the low, guttural growl of the wolf children. The growl was followed by a series of howls, sharp and piercing, as if the forest itself had come alive with sound. The group stopped in their tracks, listening. "There's no turning back now," the elder said, his voice steady but laced with fear. The group continued forward, deeper into the forest, following the sound. And then, in a clearing, they saw them again, the wolf children. This time, they were not alone. The creatures had gathered in a circle, their eyes glowing as they watched the humans approach. The elder stepped forward, raising his hands in a gesture of peace. "We come not to harm you, but to understand," he called out. For a moment, the creatures simply watched them, their eyes calculating. Then, without warning, the smaller of the 2 wolf children lunged forward, snarling. The others followed, moving with terrifying speed. The humans scrambled to defend themselves, but the creatures were too quick, darting between trees, vanishing into the shadows before they could react. "Fall back," the elder shouted, but it was too late. One of the villagers, a young woman named Alara, had been knocked to the ground by one of the creatures. It stood over her, its teeth bared, ready to strike. But before it could make a move, the elder stepped forward. "Stop," he commanded, his voice filled with authority. The wolf children hesitated, their eyes shifting between the elder and Alara. Slowly, the larger of the 2 creatures backed away, its movements cautious, as though it were waiting for something. We don't want to fight, the elder said, his voice softer now. We only want to help you. Please, tell us who you are. Why have you come here? For a long moment, there was only silence, broken only by the sound of the wind rustling through the trees. Finally, the larger wolf child stepped forward, its eyes filled with a strange sadness. We are lost, it said, its voice rough, almost human, but still too wild to be fully understood. We were once children, but now we are something else. The wolves found us when we were young, and they raised us. We are their kin, but we are still children, deep inside. The elder nodded slowly, understanding dawning on him. You were abandoned, he said gently, and you found a new family, a family of wolves. The wolf child nodded. We don't belong with the humans. They are too soft. We are wild now. The elder sighed, his heart heavy with pity. You don't have to be wild forever. You can come back with us. We'll take care of you. You are still children, and children belong with others like them. The wolf child's eyes softened, and for the first time there was a flicker of hope in its gaze. Slowly the other creatures gathered around, their posture less aggressive, more wary. The humans, still trembling, lowered their weapons. It was an ordinary Tuesday morning when Uncle Podger announced his intention to hang a picture. The sun was shining, the birds were singing, and the house was quiet, except for the sounds of breakfast being prepared in the kitchen. But as soon as the words left his lips, the atmosphere shifted. The family, all scattered throughout the house, immediately froze, and a murmur of disbelief passed through the room. Uncle Podger, with his usual flair for drama, had decided that the old family portrait, a painting of his great-grandparents, would finally be hung in the living room. I'll do it today, he said, puffing out his chest and lifting the picture frame as if it were a trophy. It'll be easy. I've got this all figured out. You all just watch. Aunt Mary, who had heard these words before, exchanged a knowing look with the others but said nothing. She knew that Uncle Podger's grand plans rarely went smoothly, but she wasn't one to discourage him. Oh, of course, dear, she said with a smile, trying to hide the skepticism in her voice. The children, already used to Uncle Podger's peculiar ways, watched from the doorway. Are you sure you don't need help, Uncle? Young Billy asked, his eyes wide with genuine curiosity. No, Billy, this is a man's job, Uncle Podger said, his tone slightly patronizing. Go on, play outside, I've got it under control. Billy looked to his mother for reassurance, but Aunt Mary merely nodded, silently signaling that this was something Uncle Podger had to do alone. Billy and his sister ran off, eager to escape the impending chaos. With exaggerated care, Uncle Podger positioned the picture against the wall in the living room. Now the first thing we need is a nail, he muttered, searching around the room as though the nail would appear magically at his command. After a moment of searching, he found one on the mantelpiece and took it in his hand with great triumph. There we go, we're halfway there. But the excitement quickly dimmed as he realized he didn't have a hammer. He glanced around the room, his eyes falling on the vase in the corner. Aha! He exclaimed, picking up the vase, holding it as though it were the most suitable tool for the job. It'll work just fine. He swung the vase back to strike the nail, but in the process, knocked over a lamp. It fell to the floor with a loud crash, and Uncle Podger winced. Not a problem, he muttered to himself. Not a problem at all. He bent down to collect the pieces, but in his haste, he hit the nail against the frame instead of the wall. It made a sound like a small explosion as the picture frame shook and the glass cracked. Aunt Mary, hearing the crash, entered the room, one hand on her hip. Podger, she began, though her voice was calm. Are you sure you know what you're doing? Of course I do, Uncle Podger said, his face flushed with determination. This is the easy part. I'll just... But before he could finish his sentence, the picture frame slipped from his hands and tumbled toward the floor. He lunged forward to catch it, only to miss and trip over a chair. The picture crashed to the ground, the glass shattering with a loud noise. Podger! Aunt Mary exclaimed, rushing to his side. For heaven's sake, can't you ever get anything right? I'll fix it, Uncle Podger insisted, already bending down to pick up the pieces of broken glass. It's just a little bit of glass. Nothing to worry about. But the damage was done. The picture was now at an angle that no one could ignore. Uncle Podger stood up, dusting himself off with a grimace. "I'll get a new frame, no problem. It'll be as good as new." Aunt Mary sighed deeply, her patience thinning. "Podger, you've already broken the frame, the glass, and the lamp. Do you really think a new frame will solve everything?" "Don't worry, Mary, I've got it under control," Uncle Podger said with a confident nod. He began rummaging through the drawers, looking for something to fix the damage. He found a roll of tape and, without thinking twice, began taping the edges of the picture frame back together. "That'll do," he muttered to himself, standing back and admiring his handiwork. The picture, now unevenly taped together, looked nothing like it had before. Aunt Mary stood there, silently shaking her head. "Now for the nail," Uncle Podger said, trying to continue with his plan. He held the nail against the wall once more, his face flushed with determination. He raised the vase once again, but just as he was about to strike the nail, a loud bang sounded from outside. The children had returned, and they rushed into the room, eyes wide with excitement. "Uncle Podger, what happened to the picture?" Billy asked, pointing at the lopsided frame. "It's fine, just fine," Uncle Podger said, hastily pushing the children away. "Now, you run along and let me finish." But just as he swung the vase down, he missed the nail entirely and struck the wall, leaving a large dent in the plaster. The picture teetered once again, threatening to fall. "Podger, please," Aunt Mary cried out, her voice trembling with frustration. "Stop, you're making it worse." Uncle Podger, undeterred by his wife's words, pulled the picture back from the edge of the table and attempted to steady it. "I just need a little more time," he muttered. "Just a little more time." The house had become a battleground. The picture hung at an angle so severe it was nearly horizontal, and the room was littered with broken glass, dented walls, and bits of furniture that had been knocked over in the chaos. And yet, Uncle Podger remained convinced that he was just a few steps away from success. Aunt Mary, her arms crossed tightly, looked at him with exasperation. "You've been at this for hours, Podger. It's time to admit defeat." But Uncle Podger wouldn't listen. He insisted that the picture would be perfect, just as soon as he found the right tools, the right approach. He spent the next hour moving the picture from one spot to another, adjusting it in the most absurd ways. He used more tape, more nails, and even managed to knock over the table in the process. Still, the picture refused to stay in place. By the time dinner came, the room was in complete disarray. The picture was still crooked on the wall, the frame barely holding together, the glass taped up with strips of adhesive. The family sat down at the table, silently watching the disaster unfold in front of them. It all began on a sweltering summer day, when two men, Sam and Bill, found themselves lounging under the scorching heat of the midday sun. They had been making plans for a heist, something big, something that would set them up for life. They were outlaws, small-time crooks who had been moving from one job to another, always on the lookout for an opportunity. That opportunity came when they heard about a wealthy family living just outside the small town of Summit. The family, the Dorset family, was known for their riches. Their daughter, a young girl, was rumored to be spoiled rotten, and they also had a young son. Unfortunately for him, he was spoiled in a much worse way. The boy's name was Johnny, and he was known far and wide as a little terror. People whispered about his wild antics, his unruly behavior, and the way he managed to drive everyone around him mad. Sam and Bill weren't interested in the boy. They were interested in his father, who had a fortune tucked away somewhere, a fortune they could get their hands on if they played their cards right. So, they decided to kidnap Johnny and ransom him back for a hefty sum. It seemed like the perfect plan: a wealthy family, a troublesome kid, and the promise of a large payout. What could go wrong? They traveled to Summit, posing as travelers seeking work, and managed to locate the Dorset estate. It wasn't hard to find. The house stood out like a jewel in the middle of the dry, arid land, surrounded by high fences and manicured lawns. Sam and Bill, both nervous but determined, watched the house from a distance, planning every move carefully. The idea was simple. They would grab Johnny, lock him up somewhere remote, and send a note demanding the ransom. The family would pay, and Sam and Bill would be off, never to return. By dusk, they had their chance. The Dorsets were hosting a small party, and the boy was out playing with some local kids. Sam and Bill saw their opportunity. They ambled over to where Johnny was playing near a grove of trees, keeping a low profile. When they reached him, they moved quickly. Bill grabbed Johnny by the arms, and Sam pulled a cloth over his mouth to silence his screams. For a moment, everything was still. The boy struggled fiercely in their grip, kicking and thrashing, his face red with rage. "Let go of me! Let go!" Johnny screamed, but Bill held him tight. "Shut up, kid. You'll be fine," Sam muttered under his breath as he tried to keep Johnny quiet. They dragged him into the woods where they had hidden a small, shack-like building. Inside, they secured the boy with ropes, making sure he couldn't escape. They then sat down at a nearby table, writing the ransom note with the sort of precision they had seen in movies. The note was simple and to the point. "Dear Mr. and Mrs. Dorset, we have your son, Johnny. If you ever want to see him alive again, you will deliver $2,000 in cash to the location specified in the attached instructions. Do not involve the police. We know the area and will be watching. Sincerely, the kidnappers." They sealed the note and prepared to send it the next morning. But what they hadn't expected was how Johnny would react to being kidnapped. That night, as they sat in the dark, Johnny began to scream. Loud, ear-piercing screams that made Sam and Bill exchange uncomfortable glances. They were used to criminals, to being tough, but they had never had to deal with a kid like this. Johnny didn't just cry, he screamed at the top of his lungs, calling for his mother and father, begging for help, and even cursing them both. But the worst part wasn't his yelling. It was the way he twisted every situation into something worse. "Shut up, you little brat," Bill muttered, but Johnny only screamed louder. The next morning, when the time came to deliver the ransom note, Sam and Bill found their nerves tested again. They had expected the boy to be a little scared, a little quiet. Instead, Johnny turned on them, taunting them with insults, threatening to make their lives miserable. He kicked, bit, and even tried to escape, an exhausting, frustrating ordeal for the two men who thought they had a simple job on their hands. When Sam tried to get Johnny to eat something, the boy spit it out and then threw his plate against the wall. "I don't want your food! I want my mom and dad!" Johnny yelled. Bill, who had never been good with children, was about ready to lose his temper. "Stop it, you little demon," he grunted, tying Johnny's ropes tighter, but it only made the boy more furious. Throughout the day, Johnny showed no signs of fear. Instead, he became more defiant, making crude jokes about the kidnappers' plans and mocking their every move. Sam and Bill, who had planned to keep Johnny subdued until the ransom was paid, found themselves on the receiving end of an endless stream of insults, one after another. "You two are dumber than my little sister," Johnny said at one point, crossing his arms defiantly. "You think you can scare me? I've got more brains than both of you combined." The day dragged on with Johnny acting like a spoiled, misbehaving brat, and the kidnappers began to question their plan. They'd expected a scared, compliant child, someone who would cry for his parents and beg for mercy. What they got instead was a boy who made their lives miserable at every turn. Finally, at dusk, Sam and Bill decided to send the ransom note anyway, figuring the sooner they did it, the sooner they could get paid and get out of this mess. But Johnny had other plans. As they tried to leave him alone for a moment, he seized the opportunity to escape. He yanked at the ropes, and before they knew it, he had wriggled free. They found him outside, on the porch, tying a rope around the door handle to keep them from entering. "You can't make me stay!" Johnny yelled, grinning wildly as he watched the two men struggle to get back inside. Sam and Bill stood frozen for a moment, their plans unraveling. Everything they had worked for had been turned upside down by a child who seemed to have an endless supply of energy and spite. Desperate, Sam decided to act quickly. "All right, kid," he said, his voice shaking with frustration. "We'll send the ransom note, but you better calm down before we both regret it." Lena stood by the window, her fingers tracing the rainwater running down the glass, watching the world outside blur in a mixture of gray and green. The storm had come in quickly, as if it had been waiting to unleash itself, and now the town was cloaked in a heavy, persistent downpour. It seemed like the rain would never stop, as though the skies themselves were mourning something that had been lost. But for Lena, This storm felt like more than just weather. It was a mirror to her own heart. It had been a hard few months. Ever since her mother had passed away, Lena had been caught in a whirlwind of grief, barely able to catch her breath between the waves of sadness and confusion that had hit her unexpectedly. She missed her mother more than words could express. Her mother had always been the one who kept everything in balance, the one who knew just how to soothe her when life felt too heavy. Now there was only silence, only the echo of her mother's absence in every corner of their small home. Lena sighed, her breath fogging up the window for a moment before it cleared. She had taken time off work, spent most of her days indoors, and allowed herself to grieve, which was something she had never done before. She had always been the strong one, the one who kept it together when everything else fell apart. But now, without her mother's steady presence, she felt like she was drowning, unsure of how to breathe in a world that felt so hollow. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of the doorbell ringing. It was a sharp, sudden noise that seemed out of place amidst the steady rhythm of the rain. Lena wiped her eyes quickly and moved toward the door, her mind racing. She wasn't expecting anyone. She opened the door, and there stood an older man, his face familiar but weathered, his hands clasped tightly around an umbrella. "Miss Lena?" he asked, his voice soft but confident. "Yes?" she replied, still a little disoriented from the sudden intrusion. The man smiled kindly. "I'm Mr. Collins from the garden store down the street. I'm here about your mother's request." Lena blinked, confused. "My mother's request?" Mr. Collins nodded. "She came by last spring and asked if we could plant a tree for you. Something special, a silver lining, if you will. She said it would be a way for you to remember the good things even in the darkest times." Lena's heart clenched. She hadn't known her mother had made such a request. It was like her mother had known that Lena would need something to hold on to when she was gone, some kind of connection to keep her grounded. "Would you like to see it?" Mr. Collins asked, his eyes bright with understanding. Lena hesitated for a moment, her emotions swirling. The thought of something so permanent, so tied to her mother, was overwhelming. But then, with a deep breath, she nodded. "Yes, I'd like to see it." The two of them stepped outside, the rain soaking into their clothes as they walked toward the back of the house. The garden, once vibrant and full of life, now looked more like a collection of memories. The flowers that had once bloomed in a riot of colors were faded, their petals drooping with neglect. Yet, there was something oddly peaceful about it all. Perhaps it was the way the rain softened the world, or the quiet that seemed to envelop everything. Mr. Collins led her to a spot near the fence, where a small sapling stood, its silver leaves shimmering faintly in the dull light. It wasn't much, just a young tree. But there was something about it that made her heart swell. It wasn't the size of the tree that mattered, but the meaning behind it. It was a symbol, a reminder of her mother's love and foresight, even in the face of her illness. "Your mother said it would be a silver lining," Mr. Collins explained gently. "A tree that would grow and provide shade for you, no matter how dark the days seemed. She believed in the healing power of nature." Lena knelt beside the tree, her fingers brushing against the silver leaves, the soft texture of them bringing a sense of calm she hadn't felt in weeks. It was as if the tree were alive, in more ways than one, and it was offering her a kind of peace she hadn't known she needed. Tears welled up in her eyes, but they weren't just tears of grief. They were tears of something else, something softer, like the beginning of acceptance. The storm outside raged on, but the tree seemed to stand unaffected, its branches swaying gently in the wind, a quiet strength in the chaos of the world. It was a silver lining, just like her mother had promised. "Thank you," Lena whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for bringing this to me." Mr. Collins smiled and patted her shoulder. "Your mother was a remarkable woman. She knew you would need this." They stood together in silence for a while, watching the rain, listening to the soft patter against the leaves of the tree. Lena felt a sense of connection to her mother, as if she were still there, still caring for her in some way, even though she was gone. The silver tree was more than just a tree. It was a message, a gift, a reminder that even in the darkest times, there was always something beautiful, something worth holding on to. As the rain began to lighten, Mr. Collins bid her goodbye, and Lena stood alone in the garden, the tree standing tall before her. The world felt different now, quieter, more settled. There was still a long road ahead of her, a journey of healing and acceptance that would take time, but in this moment, she felt as though a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. She knew her mother had prepared her for this, for the challenges ahead, and now, with the tree as a constant reminder, she would move forward, finding strength in the silver lining. Days passed, and as the weeks went on, the tree grew. It wasn't just the branches that stretched toward the sky. It was the hope that grew in Lena's heart. The pain of losing her mother never truly faded, but with each passing day, the memory of her mother's love and wisdom took root, just like the tree, grounding her in a way she couldn't have imagined before. The air was thick with the scent of freshly cut grass, and the sound of distant chatter filled the warm summer afternoon. Margaret sat at her kitchen table, absent-mindedly tracing circles on the old wooden surface, her thoughts far away. It had been weeks since the letter had arrived, and yet she still hadn't made up her mind. The invitation, handwritten in elegant script, had been a surprise. An invitation to the grand gala at the Eldridge estate, a gathering that was as renowned for its opulence as for the exclusivity that surrounded it. Margaret had always been an outsider to the world of high society. She was a school teacher, someone who spent her days in classrooms and her evenings in quiet solitude, surrounded by books and the comforting rhythm of a simpler life. But the invitation had come nonetheless. Addressed to her in fine parchment, the golden seal of the Eldridge family embossed on the front. The letter was filled with all the right words: honored guest, exclusive occasion, an evening of grandeur. And yet, it felt like a distant dream, something meant for someone else. She had read it over and over, her fingers trembling each time she unfolded it. Her mind raced with questions. Why had she been invited? What could she possibly offer in such a setting? Would she be out of place, an unwelcome figure in a sea of polished faces and fine gowns? "Why don't you go?" her sister Clara had asked the night after the invitation arrived. Clara had always been the adventurous one, the life of the party, the one who never hesitated to seize an opportunity. She had a way of making things feel simple, like everything was within reach, like there was no need to hesitate. "I don't belong there, Clara," Margaret had replied, shaking her head. "It's not for people like me." Clara had given her a long look, one that said more than words ever could. "How do you know unless you try? You've spent your whole life staying within the lines, Margaret. Maybe it's time to step outside them." But the doubt still lingered in Margaret's mind. She knew she wasn't as graceful or as charming as the women she imagined would be there. She wasn't accustomed to the social intricacies, the conversations about the latest fashions, or the weight of the glances exchanged in such circles. What if she made a fool of herself? What if she didn't fit in? As the evening of the gala approached, the invitation sat on the mantel, taunting her, daring her to open herself up to a world she'd never known. The thought of attending felt both exhilarating and terrifying. The day before the event, Margaret received a phone call. It was from a former student, Michael, now grown and working in the city. He had always admired Margaret's quiet strength and keen mind, and they had stayed in touch over the years, though their conversations were infrequent. His voice on the other end of the line was warm and familiar. "I heard you're going to the Eldridge Gala," he said, sounding genuinely interested. "I'm not sure how you feel about these things, but I think it to be a great chance for you to meet people outside your usual circles. You know, experience something different." Margaret hesitated, the old doubts rising to the surface. "I don't know, Michael. I've never been one for these kinds of events. I don't think it's really my scene." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "I understand," Michael said gently, "but sometimes stepping out of our comfort zones brings the best surprises. You're always helping others, Margaret. Maybe it's time you allowed yourself to experience something new." The kindness in his voice lingered long after the call ended, leaving Margaret with more questions than answers. What did she have to lose, really? The thought of attending had always been more of a fantasy, a what-if, a dream she had never allowed herself to entertain seriously. But now, with Michael's words echoing in her mind, she couldn't shake the feeling that maybe, just maybe, This was an invitation to something she had been too afraid to seek for herself. That evening, Margaret found herself in front of the mirror, the soft glow of the vanity lights casting a gentle halo around her. She had spent hours deliberating on what to wear, finally settling on a simple, elegant dress, nothing too extravagant, but enough to fit the occasion. The dress hugged her frame perfectly, its soft color complementing her complexion. She hesitated for a moment before she reached for the invitation once more, her fingers brushing over the embossed seal. With a deep breath, Margaret made her decision. She would go. The night of the gala, the Eldridge estate stood as an imposing figure in the distance, its windows glowing with the warmth of the gathering within. Margaret drove slowly, the headlights of her car illuminating the winding driveway that led to the grand estate. Her heart pounded in her chest, the sound of her breathing the only thing she could hear over the roaring of her nerves. The closer she got, the smaller she felt, as if the mansion itself was swallowing her whole. But when she finally arrived and stepped out of the car, something inside her shifted. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. The gates of the estate opened, and she was ushered inside by a well-dressed doorman, who greeted her with a polite smile. As she walked up the steps, the grandeur of the place took her breath away. The chandeliers, the laughter echoing from within, the murmurs of conversation. It was like stepping into a different world. The moment she entered the ballroom, her nerves threatened to overwhelm her. The sea of faces, the bright lights, the clinking of glasses, it all felt so foreign. For a moment, Margaret considered turning around, retreating to the safety of the world she knew. But then, she spotted Michael across the room, his friendly face lighting up when he saw her. "There you are," he exclaimed, making his way toward her. He was dressed sharply, a suit that seemed made for him. "You look fantastic," he added with a grin. Margaret couldn't help but smile, the tension in her chest easing at the sight of him. "Thank you," she said softly, feeling slightly more at ease. "You made it," Michael said, his voice filled with genuine warmth. "I knew you would. It's not so bad, is it?" She chuckled, the tension in her shoulders finally releasing. "Not so bad," she admitted. For the rest of the evening, Margaret found herself slowly easing into the rhythm of the event. She spoke to people she would have never imagined speaking to, laughed at jokes she wouldn't have understood just a few hours ago, and danced under the twinkling chandeliers. Each new interaction felt like a small victory, like breaking down walls she had built around herself. The invitations she had once feared turned out to be moments of connection, of joy, of acceptance.